Hey fam, what's going on? It is a Monday. This video is an extension of a dialogue that some of us are having. Some good friends and us are having this conversation. But I think it's really started by Sarah, who's a dear friend of mine. Hello, Switch. So what we're talking about broadly is, and this happens every time of year right now, because Passover is just around the corner. So with Pesach, you have the Jewish meal, the Seder meal. And it's common for Christians in their congregations to also host a Seder meal. And so the question is that Christian appropriation of Judaism if a Christian community or congregation were to host their own Seder? So I want to dive into this, and I'm going to be a little controversial for my Jewish siblings, because I think the way that us Jews tend to react is like, yeah, that's appropriation, stop doing it. And I just want to cover I want to make a case for some stuff here. I just want to talk a little bit. So the first thing that I think anytime we talk about Jewish-Christian relations, dialogue, whatever, we just have to own, and this is a big deal. So I think it needs to be repeated, right? That Christians have been terrible to Jewish people forever. For a really, really, really long time. When Rome adopts Christianity, they specifically demonize Jewish people and write them out of the story. There are anti-Semitic tropes that are started when Rome adopts Christianity 2,000 years ago, and many of those tropes are still with us today. So I think we just need to own, anytime we engage in this sort of like intersectional Christian Judaism stuff, that Christians have been really bad to Jews in big dramatic ways, like the Crusades, for example, but in little subtle ways too. I mean, it's very common in Christian communities to use the term Pharisee as a pejorative. Now, I think sometimes Pharisee is just coded a Jewish person. But even if it's not that overtly anti-Semitic, I think the idea that, Pharisees are legalistic and hypocritical, and that, Jesus had to confront them and correct them. And I mean, from a superficial reading of the gospel accounts, that presents itself to you, absolutely. But it's historically inaccurate. It's inaccurate across a whole number of lines. And so from big ways like the Crusades to daily subtle ways like using Pharisee as a pejorative, Christians have been bad to Jewish people for a really long time. The idea of Christian supersessionism, that Jesus came, that straight up fulfilled the covenant that existed with Abraham, or the covenant with Moses, or the covenant of the Torah or Tanakh, that Jesus came to fulfill that, to replace that idea of Christian supersessionism. We get this through Pauline reading, I think a misinformed Pauline reading, but at any rate, I think it just should be said that Jewish people, that we're going to be on the defensive. And I think because we're on the defensive, it comes from the history of pretty bad treatment, Christian anti-Semitism, Christian supersessionism, etc. And there's a long 2,000-year history of that. I think as a result of that Jewish people are especially sensitive to seeing any of our practices. I mean, I think, listen, Christianity itself is an extension of Judaism. There's no other way to get around that fact, because if Christianity models itself after the practices of Jesus, Jesus is not a Christian. Jesus is a Jewish person, a first century, second temple period Jewish person. And I think we can say there is an historical Jesus. Now, if we say there's an historical Jesus, all we mean to say is there's a dude who was some sort of religious leader, amassed some sort of a following, was some sort of a teacher of some sort, trained in Jewish apocalyptic literature, or that tradition at any rate. And Jesus is like, in support of bringing sacrifices to the temple. Jesus is often found around the mikvahs, the ritual baths at the foot of the temple mount. Jesus is reported as being in synagogues. So again, I don't think those reports from the gospel accounts are historically, I don't think it's fact, right? I think they're proclamations. I think they're constructed narratives that are meant to communicate a message to a first century audience. But to say that Jesus is doing anything other than participating in Second Temple period Judaism, I think is misguided. It seems clearly the case that that's what Jesus is doing. And if you even look to Paul's characterization of what Paul thinks he's doing, the way that the Acts of the Apostles describes what Paul is doing. There's sort of Paul's Paul, and then there's Paul according to the Acts of the Apostles. But the debates that they're having are about things like, they're halachic debates. They're like, hey, these pagans that want to be followers of this guy who we think is the Mashiach, Should they get circumcised? Should they follow kosher dietary practice? Things like this. There are clear first century halachic debates happening right before our eyes in the gospel accounts. So to say that Jesus is doing anything other than participating in some expression of first century Judaism, I think would be misguided. So I think it's important that we keep that top of mind. So the two things I want to put at the outset here. Christians have a long history of being really terrible to Jews, and as a result, we're especially in our feels when Christians do Jewish things. And the other part is that, like, Jesus is clearly a Jew, and that rather than, like, adopting that and learning about that and embracing that, Christians really oftentimes try to just sort of like tell the story on their own terms. And that all the stuff that is fundamental to Jewish practice, belief, understanding, narrative, etc., those things that are in the Tanakh, are the Hebrew Bible, our holy scriptures, Christians are quick to say, oh, well, this is all about Jesus the whole time. So I think Christians forget that's extremely disrespectful. Right? That's our sacred literature that has been around a lot longer than so-called New Testament stuff. So just to be like, oh yeah, that's about Jesus. I think Christians need to understand that's really a terribly terrible thing to say. I would love for you all to follow Jesus without at the same time imposing that back onto Tanakh. So those are some of the problems in the atmosphere here, in the ether. But what about a Seder itself? So I think if let me go two ways about this. I think if, like, Christian congregations are trying to get themselves a Haggadah and a Seder plate and, like, doing Seder, yes, I would say that is appropriation. That is not yours to exercise or to practice. If you're interested in that, then invite a Jewish person to join you, and we'll explain the Haggadah to you. We'll explain the Seder to you. We'll help to talk about why retelling the story was really important in our tradition. So we can have dialogue and cooperation and learn together. But should Christians be like, no Haggadah in church? that's the thing. It's a thing to say. But should you do any sort of a Seder thing? And I think this is where Sarah, my dear friend, this is where Switch has picked up on a thing here. Is that, listen, Pesach is in the gospel accounts. It's in all four of the canonical gospel accounts. Now, the gospel according to John, the fourth gospel, has Jesus eating the Pesach meal. In fact, he becomes, according to the gospel of John, Jesus is the paschal sacrifice. According to the synoptic accounts, Jesus directs the disciples, go prepare the Passover meal. But even though the itinerary is a little bit different, it is the case that Pesach is in all four of the canonical Gospels. So I think as Jewish people, we should realize, that Jesus, as much as he was a Second Temple period Jew, had some sort of a Passover meal. It's in all four of the accounts, which I don't think are veridical. I don't think there's historical veracity in the accounts. But I think the narratives were constructed with Pesach, and more than that. I mean, you get a lot of the Jewish festivals showing up in different parts of the Gospels. So I think on both, Christians should understand how sensitive we are to Christians doing Jewish things, because y'all have been terrible to us for thousands and thousands of years. So we're going to be up in our feels about some of this, so that you should know that as just a point of cultural sensitivity. Christians should own that and accept that and take some accountability for that and work to dismantle ongoing supersessionism and Christian anti-Semitism. So the onus is on Christians to understand how they might be getting themselves in some hot water if they're going to start hosting a Seder. But I think the flip side, to speak to my Jewish siblings, the reality is that if you read the Gospels, you're reading Jewish literature. Just because Rome adopts Christianity and then writes Jewish people out of the story and then ultimately becomes New Testament, Old Testament, right? And there's this terrible divide and that has led to the harm of Jewish people. The reality is that if you didn't have like New Testament, Old Testament, and you just kept reading Tanakh and it turned into gospel stuff, it would read like the Talmud. I mean, it really would for the most part. I mean, this like Jewish apocalyptic literature, like the Apocalypse of Baruch or the Enochic literature, the book of Daniel. There's a ton of Jewish apocalyptic literature that reads thematically very similar to the gospel accounts. So I think as much as Christians need to understand and take accountability for what they've been doing for 2,000 years and be sensitive that they are tiptoeing the line of continued misappropriation, I think as Jewish people, we also need to acknowledge, I would say embrace Jesus. That doesn't mean we need to say Jesus was Mashiach. I'm not a Messianic Jew by any stretch of the imagination. I don't think Jesus was Mashiach. I don't think Jesus is the Son of God in any sense like that. I think there was a mythic understanding the same way that like David HaMelech was understood as like a son of God. Maybe there was an attribution of Jesus as a son of God in that like sort of like kingship and monarchical understanding and anointed understanding. But I think as Jewish people, there's a very compelling story to tell that through Christianity, it's Judaism. For the most part, if you read the synoptic accounts, especially when Jesus is in debate with the Pharisees, yeah, Christians have misread that. And Christians have taken that to be the case that Jesus is somehow correcting the Pharisees. But when we read our Talmud, when we read the debates between Hillel and Shammai, what we see in the gospel accounts, very similar halachic debates between the Pharisees and the Jesus movement. How do you observe Shabbat? What about ritual hand washing? Things like this. This is what the Jesus movement and the Pharisees are disagreeing about. So I think there's a compelling story to tell to Jewish people, and I don't think we always invest the time to understand. I think we just treat the New Testament only through the lens of these Christians have been terrible to us, so why would we want to read anything that they've done? But that, I think, cuts us off. That you get some of the very best description of Second Temple period Judaism through the gospel accounts. We didn't record a lot, likely because Rome sacked the temple and slaughtered us. So, and we had to hide our records in like Qumran, like the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff. So we don't have a lot of like first-hand Jewish accounts. And I'm not saying the Gospels are first-hand by any means. They're not historical in that way. But I think for Jewish people to understand, the Gospels kind of read like Talmud. The Gospels kind of read like Jewish apocalyptic literature. The Gospels kind of give you a window into Second Temple period Judaism, where we've had a lot of those records stolen from us in the slaughtering and sacking of the temple done by Rome. So, is a Christian Seder appropriation? No Haggadahs in church. If you've got a Seder plate, yes, appropriation. But if you're like, Jesus was reclining at an important meal and there was some degree of ritual cleanliness involved and there was a bread and there was a wine that carried some significance, put in those terms, I mean, it sounds like Kiddush. You know what I mean? So I just think there's subtle nuance, and that we ought not, either Christians, because they want Jesus to be the king and over everything, and it was all about him, wrong. But also, for Jewish people, we've got a window into our history through the gospel accounts, and we shouldn't cut that off just because we're up in our feels about centuries of Christian anti-Semitism. So I think it's a little bit of a negotiation here that we have to engage in. Okay, that's 12 and a half minutes. I got to shut up. Love you, fam. Peace out.